Welcome to episode 84 of the GTO on 5G. It's the latest insight scoop on everything 5G. We cover 6 topics in about 15 minutes, and it's brought to you by More Insights and Strategy. I'm Will Townsend, and joining me again this week is fellow analyst Anshel Sag. Let's get started with my first topic, and it's earnings season. AT&T announced its 4Q earnings, and a couple of insights that I pulled from it. Both broadband and mobility were up 5% year over year. I found it interesting that AT&T reported nearly 900,000 postpaid phone net adds. So from my perspective, they're continuing to drive the 5G upgrade cycle. I know you're going to talk about Apple here on your first topic, but from my perspective, AT&T continues to execute against earnings. And what I also find interesting with the fiber upside is that fiber is a big investment, continues to be a big investment for AT&T. That's going to provide the needed backhaul for 5G. And, you know, by all intents and purposes, AT&T continues to execute. I will have likely an update on our next podcast around auction 110, the DoD auction. With some insights with Chris Sambar, an executive that is managing a lot of AT&T's build out there, but would love to get your insights.
Yeah, I think when you look at what's going on with AT&T, I think them refocusing on their core business has paid dividends. I believe that the Time Warner spinoff will occur sometime this year, from what I recall when I heard about the earnings. So that's going to help them continue to focus on their core business. That said, it is interesting to see that they are starting to move away from a fiber-only discussion when it comes to broadband.
Yeah.
Because for a while they were poo-pooing millimeter wave for fixed wireless, but now they're starting to talk a little bit more about fixed wireless. So we'll see what happens with that in terms of delivering services, but you know, while they did announce earnings, they also announced their new 2 and 5 gigabit fiber plans, which are pretty interesting because they're pretty competitive in terms of pricing. Yeah. And I think they allow AT&T to make incremental revenue on existing fiber deployments and being able to have, you know, higher average revenue per user, but also offer something that a lot of their competitors can't do because they aren't delivering fiber. They're not investing in it. And, you know, you and I both have AT&T fiber, so we're both happy customers. But I think the biggest problem for AT&T is really just the footprint of their fiber deployments and, you know, being very smart about where they deploy and how densely they choose to go.
I would agree with that. And John Stankey has been on record, the CEO for AT&T, that fiber will continue to be a strategic investment. And to your point, that benefits both mobility and broadband so that they can get that recoup on that investment in that fiber layout, because laying fiber is not an inexpensive or trivial effort. But that's a nice segue to your first topic. You know, I was talking about net phone ads with AT&T, and you want to talk about the iPhone 13 and some news from Apple.
Yeah, so Apple published gangbuster revenue and profit. I think they hit record for both. They actually reported iPhone sales of $65 billion for the fourth quarter.
Wow.
Which is up 17% year over year.
That is nuts.
And almost a 10% higher than Wall Street's expectations. They stopped reporting iPhone unit sales last year, but Wall Street still compiles its estimates, and they're saying that they estimated around 76 million iPhones were sold. And the big deal was that 5G was driving a lot of this. Tim Cook said that globally, 5G is a bit of a patchwork quilt in terms of availability and speeds. But the interesting part is that in the US and China, he said that they see that their network, the 5G network, is well established, which I think is a little bit questionable, just because if you look at what's going on with mid-band, it's, you know, coverage is there, but I think the network experience isn't quite there yet. So I think there is a chance for another wave of 5G upgrades.
Mhm.
But in the US and China, a lot of people were getting iPhone 12s and iPhone 13s. And I think that when you look at what's happening with the iPhone sales, it's not going to be an Apple unique phenomenon. The interesting was that Europe was not very highly graded by Tim Cook when he talked about the 5G rollout,
Yeah.
and that they're just not where the US and China are. And that obviously Korea has a great, coverage, which a lot of these things kind of uh, agree with what I was writing in my piece that I released last week about the state of 5G. So validates a little bit of my beliefs, but overall, it's interesting to see Apple's tack when it comes to 5G starting to change, which I also suspect is because next year they're going to be announcing their own modem, and
Mhm.
we're going to have to, they're going to market that 5G capability way more than they have in the past.
Absolutely. And I'm also not surprised that Apple and Tim Cook were not bullish on Europe. We've spoken about Europe in the past as a region. It's inherently a more complex region. Each country has its own spectrum auctions and regulations and that sort of thing. And the EU is still, in the European Commission, is still trying to figure out harmonization and that sort of thing as you cross border to border. So, and I also believe that in Europe, the focus has really been mostly on access and not necessarily use case. And you're beginning to see more focus on use case in places like China and the US and in Korea. We've spoken about South Korea as being a real leader with respect to leading with 5G use case versus access. So all of that, ladders up and marries up to what you were commenting on in your Forbes article, which, if our viewers and listeners haven't read that article on Forbes, highly recommend you do it. Anshel did a great job really going in depth on sort of the state of 5G. But let's move to my second topic this week. And I want to talk about some news out of France. SigFox, who is an IoT solution provider, declared that they had to go into receivership. So this is not a good thing. It's not a surprise to a lot of analysts, including myself. SigFox built a purpose-built network, really focused on narrowband IoT to compete with technologies like LoRaWAN. And at the end of the day, they couldn't find a way to truly monetize it. So my question is, does this herald the opportunity for 5G to pick up the IoT slack? And so I certainly think it can. 5G inherently, based on the 3GPP standard, can support a massive increase in the number of devices over LTE, and certainly can support both massive, higher bandwidth IoT as well as narrowband IoT. So one solution now goes away. I still believe there'll be an opportunity for LoRaWAN and some tech that does a lot of the silicon design in LoRaWAN sensor devices and solutions to exist. But certainly I believe this opens up the opportunity for 5G to kind of, pick up the slack, but would love to get your insight.
Yeah, it's funny. I was actually going to ask you if you thought LoRaWAN had a better chance.
I think it does now. I think, Semtech's got solid technology. I've been on the record saying that. I do believe the LoRaWAN Alliance could be doing more and be more strategic to drive the ecosystem. And we have an IoT generalist, Bill Curtis, at the firm that would probably concur with my conclusion there. But yeah.
Yeah, I also was thinking about how the cost of cellular has come down, especially in the IoT space.
Yeah.
And I think that's going to eventually be hard to beat when it really hits scale. So we'll see what happens down the road, but it's never good to hear when a company goes into bankruptcy, and we'll see what happens with the IP and technology.
Agreed. And I agree with you as well. Competition breeds typically innovation and price competitiveness. So I'm not dancing on SigFox's grave. I mean, there is an opportunity and a possibility that they may not go away completely, that they could be picked up by another company that wants to invest in them, but time will tell. But let's move to your second topic this week. And this has been big news. It's been a on and off battle, around the world for NVIDIA and ARM, but you wanted to give an update on where things stand.
Yeah, so basically, there have been a lot of rumors that the NVIDIA merger with ARM, well, it's more of an acquisition than anything,
Right.
is slowly kind of drifting into the abyss, because this deal was announced in September of 2020.
Hmm.
And we're already more than a year out. Almost, we're probably coming up on a year and a half now.
Hmm.
And it just doesn't look good for NVIDIA. And the thing is that I think the real big stumbling block in my mind was always going to be the UK, because ARM is their home turf, and it's one of their last left chip makers. So they were going to be very, they're going to be very critical of that deal. But the real surprise was the US FTC, which I believe was a consequence of the election, and Biden putting in a more aggressive person in charge of the FTC. So we're going to see what happens, but most likely it's going to die. And lots of the rumors say that NVIDIA, is already spinning up its own custom chip design capabilities in Israel, as a hedge to this. So, in addition to that, they are also working on making an IPO for ARM, which I think at one point ARM was a public company. So we'll see what happens. One of NVIDIA's biggest criticisms of the criticism of this deal was that if they went public, if ARM went public, they would be less of an innovative company and they wouldn't have as much ability to invest in the future.
Yeah.
But I'm not really sure if that's necessarily the truth, but I could see that possibly being true. But they were already a public company, so at this point, I think we just got to let things shake out. But the truth is that once SoftBank put ARM up for sale and the top bidder was NVIDIA, Pandora's box was opened, and now Risk 5 has a lot of interest. That said, it's still in the very early stages, and I think it'll still be quite some time until Risk 5 becomes a competitor to ARM, and in the same vein that ARM is capable of today.
I agree. And I also agree with your assessment that the FTC is likely the nail in the coffin here. And I'm not surprised, because a lot of the recent news flowing from the Biden administration is around how to control inflation by increasing competitiveness. And I think some of it is misguided with respect to the belief that grocery stores are monopolies, which I don't believe they are. They operate on low margins, and we never get political on these podcasts, but I think it was just the climate. The administration is keenly focused on improving competitiveness, and they viewed this as anti-competitive. So it's likely the nail in the coffin. But as you were saying, there's never ever finality until the dance stops. So we will definitely keep our eyes and ears open on this one and report back as things develop. But finally, I want to cover my third topic this week, and it's around Ericsson's 4Q earnings performance. And the question is enterprise sort of the next big 5G push for the infrastructure giant? And certainly their CEO says it is. And I've spoken about their acquisition of Cradlepoint. There hasn't been a lot of visibility around how Ericsson is going to leverage Cradlepoint into the enterprise, but it's quite clear Cradlepoint has got a solid install base, and they have products that are quite mature. You could argue they have a lead in some respects with respect to some of the on-go CBRS designs that will power private networks within the enterprise. But I was especially impressed with Ericsson's earnings. And so just at a high level for 4Q, they reported a net profit of over $1 billion US dollars, which represents a 41% increase year over year. I mean, that is huge. And what I also find interesting is their CEO spoke to 2022 and noted that they felt Ericsson had opportunities with densification. You and I have talked about that. There's going to be a need for densification, especially with C-band spectrum assets. But the CEO also spoke to opportunities with mid-band deployments in 5G. And so I think you alluded to that, I think earlier, when you look at, what's primarily been deployed today, it's either been millimeter wave, which has been Verizon's focus, or it's been low band in many parts of the world. In the US, again, T-Mobile really has the only complete deployment of, low mid, and, they're getting into high band as well. But that certainly is an opportunity, and certainly as Verizon and AT&T, as an example, in the US, begin to deploy their C-band and eventually deploy their assets from Auction 110, which I plan to talk about in more detail next week when that quiet period lifts with the FCC. It seems like Ericsson has a lot of opportunity in front of it, but would love to get your insights.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the enterprise opportunity is huge, and I don't think it's going to be realized until coverage gets to a point where it's ubiquitous for mid-band. Because low band is great, but the real use cases are going to be in standalone, and they're going to be in mid-band. And I think I called this months ago now, that I think Verizon and AT&T are delaying their standalone deployments until they have enough mid-band coverage.
Yeah,
so
that makes sense. Yeah.
I think that we're at this point that enterprise use cases are going to be most likely to happen when coverage and standalone are both at a reasonable point. So I think we're definitely some time away from that, especially when you look at Verizon and AT&T. So and also we've been talking about this for months now, but densification is going to be a thing. Neither AT&T nor Verizon's networks are built dense enough. And AT&T has been very straightforward about the increase in investment that it's going to have to make. But I think that fiber deployment will also help it amortize those costs. Nonetheless, Verizon still has to really come public with what they plan on doing. But I just think that we're going to see AT&T ramp pretty quickly. And I wonder about Verizon, especially with their roadmap showing that they're basically going to be in last place when it comes to covering on mid-band by 2023. So we'll see what happens. But yeah, I think it's going to be very interesting for Ericsson, especially.
Yeah. And yeah, totally agree. Spot on assessment there. Verizon is definitely in third place here. They're going to have the biggest uphill battle with respect to densification. I think I've mentioned this on other podcasts that as I've spoken with AT&T executives, they feel like they have enough capacity that's dark right now that they can light that up, and that will help buffet some of what they have to do from a densification perspective. Well, I keep wanting to get into the 110 auction, and we will next week, but I can share this. It's public information. The spectrum profile is much better from a propagation perspective than C-band, and so again, I'll be sharing more details on what AT&T's position is there. But I think what we'll see at the end of the day when the dust settles on 110 is that AT&T is going to come out looking like a winner, and that's going to equate to a lower capex investment in densification. But with that said, again, we'll come back to that next week. But your third and final topic, maybe this is the final on the FAA, FCC, debacle. But you want to provide an update, and there are going to be some hearings apparently in DC, and you have a very revealing statistic that the FCC or the FAA has already shared, right?
Yeah. So the FAA, I believe this was actually scheduled back in October, which is funny considering everything that happened.
Yeah.
But yes,
I thought it was an emergency meeting that was called, but I didn't know.
This was it's almost like they saw that this disaster was coming. So the FAA administrator Steve Dixon, along with aviation and wireless industry officials, will be speaking with Congress at a hearing, basically talking about the 5G impact on aviation safety. There's going to be a lot of people asking a lot of questions about why this happened, how
Pop
it
your
got to this
popcorn.
point.
Pop your popcorn. It's going to be like the Facebook hearings a few years ago.
Yeah. But what's interesting is that I think yesterday the FAA came out with a statement saying that 90% of aircraft have compliant um, altimeters.
Yeah.
So we're already talking about less than 10% or somewhere under 10% of airplanes that might not be compliant. And we're still finding out what that number will be. So, and it keeps inching up, right? It started at 48, then went to 62 or 65. Now we're at 90.
That's 90. Yeah.
And it's January 25th. So, and it feels like they didn't really start this until about a month ago. So the whole situation is kind of a disaster. It's very frustrating. I think we all can agree on that.
Yeah.
But we will see what happens with the end result, as in what will have to be done at airports. Verizon has already agreed not to turn on a bunch of sites around airports, but that only represents less than 10% of their planned deployment.
Right.
So we'll see what happens long term, but I think this is probably going to take another year to actually shake out. But I think it would be really great to hear from the FAA why things happened the way they did. And my biggest question is why they sat on this report that obviously supported their point of view.
Yeah.
And I was reading some threads online about what was happening, and some people were saying that um, there was a disagreement, and there wasn't really anybody to mitigate this disagreement because the NTIA is supposed to be the agency that ensures federal spectrum policy is unified, and um, it's just interesting to see that there was a very big breakdown of regulatory behavior, and ultimately there should have been money allocated aside um, during this auction
Yeah.
to alleviate concerns
Right.
and to allow people to make upgrades where they were necessary. But I ultimately believe that the FAA did this because they didn't get the money that they wanted. Because it doesn't make sense why they would sit on this for over a year and then suddenly make a big stink about it right before. So
Yeah.
it's either incompetence or it's greed. I'm not sure which it is, but it's one of the two, and we're hopefully going to find out during this hearing.
Yeah. And I don't buy the fact that it was an administration transition. I mean, and obviously we had Pi with the FCC, exit when Biden was elected, and we have a new chairwoman that's heading the FCC, and now we have Mayor, Senator, Secretary Pete, who's the new Secretary of Transportation. The FAA falls underneath that. I don't buy that it was sort of an administration transition.
Well,
I expect that we're going to hear that. Yeah.
Most of the people who work in the FAA didn't change. It's mostly like the top echelon
Right.
of the administration, and if certain things weren't put into place before the transition, there's no reason why they would have been afterwards. So somebody failed to do their job, and I hope we find out who it was.
Yeah, and I hope someone loses their job.
Well, maybe they already lost it.
Probably. Well, with that said, buddy, it was another great podcast this week. Why don't you take us home?
Absolutely. We hope our viewers and listeners found this week's topics interesting. If anyone out there would like to provide insight on a specific 5G topic for a future podcast, please reach out to us on social media. Will is at Welltown Tech, and I'm at Anshel. We hope you have a great weekend, and please tune again next week.